screen now. Can somebody just let me know that they can see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent, thank you very much. So this afternoon or this evening or this morning, wherever you are in the world, as Michal says, I want to talk about some recent and ongoing work on linking life and landscape. But the most important thing I want to start off with is to say that all geomorphological research is heavily collaborative. We rely on our interactions with other people in our research groups and colleagues around the world, and we rely on the inspiration and earlier work of others that have gone before us. And I showed this image here. This was the optimistic e-Christmas card that I sent around the world to people, wishing everybody all good wishes for 2020. Well, how that didn't entirely turn out how I expected, unfortunately. But this image just shows a happy group of people that work alongside me in the Oxford Resilient Buildings and Landscapes Lab, and many of whose work I'll be talking about directly or indirectly this afternoon. So I want to talk about four main things today. I want to start off talking a little bit about where we are at the moment in terms of linking life and landscape and what the challenges are. I then want to talk about two case studies, one involving the wonderful world of ants and geomorphology, and the other looking at patchy vegetation and geomorphology. And I want to finish off by talking about some ongoing research I'm doing with a colleague and towards a paper that we're writing and we hope to submit in the next couple of months. So any feedback on all of this will be incredibly useful. So let's first of all look at linking life and landscape. Well, this has been a very ongoing theme for geomorphologists, ecologists, biologists, all sorts of people for many years. And there are a number of different terms that are used, like geoecology, ecosystem engineering, geobiology, ecohydraulics. And they all really tackle very similar issues, but perhaps coming from quite different directions. And the direction that I followed is using this term biogeomorphology, which I've defined in the Encyclopedia of Geomorphology in what I think is an incredibly dull way, as an umbrella term to describe studies which focus on the linkages between ecology and geomorphology. But the reason for focusing on this definition just now is because it highlights the fact that this is linkages between ecology and geomorphology. And that's really important, that this links a whole complexity of things about the interactions between living and non-living parts of the environment. When I've given talks on biogeomorphology in the past, people often ask, well, does it include humans or doesn't it include humans? And that's something perhaps we can come back to at the questions at the end. But what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon is largely looking at biogeomorphology without humans, but very much influenced by human activities. So what's actually going on in biogeomorphology? Well, some very useful work started by Dov Korenblit and my colleague Larissa Naylor have tried to categorize different types of biogeomorphic processes. And essentially these fall into two groups: autogenic, that involve organisms modifying geomorphology by their own structures. And here we see on the left an example of coral reefs as a classic example of autogenic bioconstruction. So these are very, very important types of biogeomorphology, but perhaps are relatively rare in comparison with the next category of biogeomorphic processes, which is the allogenic ones. The ones whereby species modify geomorphology by transforming non-living materials and modulating their fluxes via mechanical or other means. So we can see on the left-hand side here an example of beaver dams being an example of allogenic bioconstruction. And on the right-hand side, you can see an example of coastal gastropods in terms of being an active example of bioerosion. So this is one useful way of categorizing the different types of influences that different species might have on geomorphology. But there are, as with all categorizations, a number of questions, a number of grey areas. Life is never as simple as even these diagrams suggest. But let's look at where we've come from when we're thinking about biogeomorphology. There is a case for Charles Darwin as being one of the fathers of biogeomorphology, specifically because of his 1882 book on the formation of vegetable molds through the action of worms. This is a remarkable book. If you haven't read it, I would really urge you to have a look at it. It's very modern in the way that he has some field experiments in his back garden. It has some wonderful chapter titles. I think there's one something along the lines of how earthworms have transformed the world. And there's a rich array of useful information and speculation. And earthworms continue to be of geomorphological interest. The image on the right here was taken during a walk the other day after very, very wet and cold weather where I live on the Isle of Portland in Dorset, showing the landscape, this beautiful chalk limestone grassland peppered with worm casts as the worms were evidently moving a lot of soil material about. But of course, there are lots of other classic works within biogeomorphology, or which could be seen as the founding parts of biogeomorphology. But I want to focus on today. So what are the big questions facing biogeomorphology today? So on the left-hand side, we can see a list of 4 sets of questions. I would argue that these are organized in increasing temporal and spatial scale. So we're very interested in the essence of how ecological and geomorphic systems interact. People are also interested as to whether there's a geomorphological signature of life. If we look at any landscapes, can we pinpoint those where life has had a crucial impact? This is clearly important for attempts to explore the morphology of other planetary surfaces, where if we can determine a geomorphological signature of life that could be picked up, that would be phenomenally helpful. The third question relates to how important biodiversity is to landscape evolution and vice versa. And finally, perhaps one of the biggest questions, have life and landscape co-evolved? If we look at the conceptual graph on the right-hand side, we can just see some fairly recent sets of concepts and frameworks which have been designed to tackle these kind of questions. And there's a lot of really interesting work. I would point out the work of Jana Eichel in coming up with the notion of biogeomorphic feedback windows, for example, and the work of Jonathan Phillips and others on this macroevolutionary biogeomorphology. Lots of really interesting ideas buzzing around. But there's also a lot of interest at the moment in the kinds of methods that are being used in biogeomorphology today. And this comes from a sample of 50 papers just showing the general dominance of monitoring, mapping and modelling as key skills, key methods deployed in biogeomorphological studies. And I think the one thing that I'd just like to point out here is that because biogeomorphology deals with this interface between ecology and geomorphology, we have a rich coming together of different types of methods, different approaches to collecting data, to understanding the world around us. So it perhaps might be that biogeomorphology is a space for innovation scientifically, as indeed are many of these places where we have interdisciplinary research interests coming together. So just to finish off on this section, I think there are a number of different challenges for biogeomorphology at the moment. And if you want to see more detail on these, I think I had 10 challenges. Please look at the paper at the bottom of the screen in Geomorphology. But the two challenges I want to pick up on here are, firstly, the notion that we need to develop some kind of modelling toolkit to analyse biogeomorphological systems. And secondly, the challenge that there is lots of data out there, and perhaps it would be useful to carry out some reanalysis or meta-analysis, they're slightly different things, of some of this data to test key hypotheses. The two examples that I want to talk about now address these two challenges, but in reverse order. So we're going to start, first of all, looking at reanalyzing data, and then we're going to move to looking at a modelling toolkit. So this brings me to the wonderful world of ants as geomorphological agents and the work I've been doing recently on a global assessment. Now, when we look at the left-hand side image, how it started, this is an example of the shoulders of previous researchers that contemporary work stands on. So J.C. Branner was an influential geologist in the USA, I think at Stanford, and he did some really interesting work in the very early 20th century, quantifying and trying to understand the geological work of ants. He also did a number of other very interesting pieces of research, which might be classed nowadays as biogeomorphology. But how this paper came about is really a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to give it as one example of perhaps some positive news coming out of the dreadful pandemic. So being in lockdown with my husband, who happens to be a geomorphologist, one of my daughters, who happens to be a GIS professional, and surrounded by billions of ants, made us start thinking about trying to put together a database to tackle this kind of bigger scale problem. It was something I'd thought about for a long time beforehand, but never had the opportunity to get to grips with. So what do these ants look like around where I live in Portland in Dorset? Well, actually, if you go around many parts of the world, maybe this is a challenge for all of you when you leave this seminar, go out, have a look in your local area and see, is there any evidence of ants and their geomorphological roles? So for example, on Portland, which is limestone and this beautiful limestone grassland, there is ample evidence of the role of Lasius flavus, a mound building ant species. And you can see here the kinds of mounds that are produced and the impact that they have on the look of the landscape. And again, if you look at those from Google Earth, this is one of the places that I just showed in that previous image, but viewed from the air, you can see quite a dense array of these ant mounds. The two very large things just below the Portland and the 10-meter bar are not ant mounds, but the other small things are indeed these ant mounds. So there are many places in the world where you can go out and measure these things, understand them, monitor them. But there's also now a terrific array of other data, bioinformatics data, which we can use to, if you like, upscale the observations. So this is one of the maps that you can find on the Ant Maps website. And the Ant Maps website is simply the front end or a way of visualizing the information from the Global Ant Biodiversity Information Project, which is run by Evan Economo and colleagues. And so you can see that the ant species responsible for the mounds on Portland is very widely distributed across Northern Europe, Southern Europe, and into Asia. And there are also some records, perhaps, of introductions of this species elsewhere. So I got to thinking that perhaps the combination of data sets already established and these bioinformatics tools gave the possibility to really create some global perspectives on what ants are doing geomorphologically. But the first step in this really is just to try and get a bit more of a handle on what kinds of functions ants do within a geomorphological system. And this conceptual diagram shows that if we start off over on the left-hand side, that one of the main things that ants do is they construct nests. And we're talking about non-arboreal ants here. So ants not in trees, but ants that grow on, in, or around the soil and the earth's surface. Sometimes they produce obvious surface mounds, sometimes they produce obvious subsurface galleries, often they produce both. And then if you track your way across this conceptual diagram, you can see that they do a whole range of things, both under the surface towards the bottom of the image and above the surface. And Betard, in a very interesting paper about insects in geomorphology last year in ESPL, calls these things these beautiful insect landscapes or antscapes. And there are some wonderful visions of these landscapes, but that's perhaps not the most important thing. The most important thing is over on the right-hand side, which is the impact these have, this intercomplex nature of ant activity, the impacts they have on sediment transfer. And I think that's the real thing that it would be very good for these bioinformatics tools and data collection to try and address in more detail. And we've only just scratched the surface in the example that I'm now going to talk about. So what did we do in lockdown when we weren't as a family just squabbling and generally getting on each other's nerves? We put together our ant geomorphology database. This shows the distribution of sites around the world. The database is based on 117 sets of data collected from just over 80 published papers. I'm sure there are more data points that could be added to the database. The database itself is available as supplementary material from the paper, and I'd be really interested if people have any additional sites and data sets they'd like to add. But to be in the database, we needed to have geolocation, we needed to have some species names of who was there, and we needed to have some quantification of what they were doing, whether they were building mounds, and if so, how big, whether they were creating underground galleries, whether they were involved in weathering, anything like that. We've also added to the database an assessment of the sampling strategy used in each study, because it's very apparent when you start looking into the literature that some people just measure one mound, whereas other people measure 300 mounds. So the database now has some ideas about that in there as well. But what can we get from this database then? Well, for example, we can quantify and map information on the diameters of ant mounds. So for example, this set of data comes from 52 different studies involving 33 species. And when we look at the data, we can see that the median diameter is 64 centimeters. We could also do that for heights, again, from 45 studies on 28 species, where we find the median height is 29 centimeters. But what you can see by looking at this geographically is the very big range in diameters according to whether you're essentially in South America or in the rest of the world. Another thing we can look at then is information on the depths of ant nests. And again, we have this therefore for a range of different species in different places. This data set comes from 24 studies involving 22 species, and the median depth is 146 centimetres. And again, when you look at the geographical spread of data, you can see it's more restricted and there's perhaps less variability in the depths than there are in terms of the height and diameter of the surface mounds. So we also looked at things such as densities, because there can be, believe it or not, up to 125 ant mounds per hectare. So these things can actually dominate the landscape. But really what I wanted to do to start to finish off this example is to show you the kinds of data that we can get on the rate of ant bioturbation or ant sediment movement, because this is starting to tackle the question of how much material ants actually move. So the thing I want you to notice here is that we've plotted this according to the genus of ant involved. And again, there are relatively few studies that attempt this kind of quantification. The other thing that's really important to note is that studies use very, very different methodologies to produce their quantification. So it's actually quite hard to compare the data in a meaningful way. But as a first attempt, these are 25 studies based on the action of 17 species. And the median figure is 1.5 tonnes per hectare per year of sediment moved as a result of surface mounding and or bioturbation. But how can we move from this to get a bit more of a global pattern? Well, this is in fact the work that I'm working on at the moment, which I'm going to be giving a presentation at the EGU on later in the year. So Evan Economo and colleagues, through their GABI system, have produced this wonderful map of species richness in ants. And as you can see, there is a strong latitudinal gradient here. But there's also quite a lot of information now about where ants grow and what percentage of the Earth's surface might be covered by ant activity. So the very first order estimate we've come up with, and this is actually published in the paper at the bottom of the slide here, which is where most of this information has come from. Our first order estimate is that ants probably move something like 7.5 gigatons of sediment per year. And we can compare that with Savitsky and Kettner's 2011 estimate that the rivers now in the world move approximately 13 gigatons of sediment per year into the ocean. So about half the amount moved by rivers is probably moved by ants. And we can also compare this with what I think is a rather over-optimistic or pessimistic, depending which way you look at it, estimate of how much humans move per year by Cooper et al. In 2018, where they come up with something like 300 gigatons of sediment. So in comparison, ants only move about 2.5% as much. I wouldn't give great credence to any of these figures. The point I'm trying to make is that we're now poised to be able to make more sensible, upscaled global estimates of both the quantity of material moved and the species involved and the way that they do that in different places. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is move to quite a different project, but another project that tackles one of the methodological challenges for biogeomorphology. And this is the work which largely was carried out and is still being carried out by my former DPhil student, doctoral student, Jenny Richards, who's now doing further work on this as part of her postdoctoral career. And we've been working very much in collaboration with Chinese scientists from the area of Northwest China, where this project is focused. And we've been looking at how patchy vegetation, wind and sediment movement interact, and what implications this might have for the conservation and management of earth and heritage sites. So again, this is a bit of a different dimension of applying biogeomorphology to managing some big conservation problems in different parts of the world. Now, earth and heritage sites are very common around the world. Earth is obviously one of the fundamental building materials found in most places, but they're also very vulnerable, especially once, as you can see in this image, when they become ruined. And our project focuses on Suyang Ancient City in Gansu province in northwest China. This is in a cold, arid environment, and it is part of a World Heritage Site of the Eastern Silk Road. And it was a very important meeting point city within this area of northwest China, of the eastern parts of the Silk Road. And Suyang was constructed somewhere between the Han and the Tang dynasties, covering a period of about 1,000 years, from 2,000 years ago to about 1,000 years ago. And looking at the site from the air, from Google Earth, the site itself is the slightly wonky rectangle on the top left of the slide. The geomorphological setting is fascinating. It's set on an alluvial fan. There's lots of evidence around the site for now abandoned agricultural systems where the food was grown to support the people who lived at Suyang. And about, I think, 700 years ago, the meandering river system in the area shifted suddenly, leaving this site dried out and contributing at least to the abandonment of Suyang. But if you go there today, this is what it looks like: a series of earthen walls, all ruined, between a couple of meters and 8 meters in height, with this patchy vegetation, anchored dunes, and all the lursic sediment around the site, producing a very interesting landscape. Now, one of the challenges when you're working at any heritage site is that it's quite difficult to actually study the heritage walls themselves. It's hard to get permission to do experiments, certainly hard to get permission to take samples. So one of the challenges is finding a way of collecting useful information that might be relevant to helping the conservation of this heritage. And we were lucky enough that our colleagues from Dunhuang Academy were able to build 4 test walls as part of a Royal Society International Exchange project, which we were able to study in some detail and also to carry out some erosion experiments on, rather than actually touching the walls themselves. So the other thing I just wanted to note about this site is, thanks to our Chinese colleagues, we have a very good vegetation survey. These 2 are the main species of kind of scrubby, shrubby kind of plants that are found at the site. And the vegetation growth and the vegetation patterns seemingly quite stable in this area. Jenny has compared remotely sensed imagery over a certain time period of a couple of decades, and there doesn't seem to be any great change in the vegetation. So how do we go about doing the modelling? Well, what we do is we work with colleagues within the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford who've already got a good model for looking at patchy vegetation, sediment and wind. And that's this VISTA model, which was pioneered by Richard Bailey and taken forward by Jerome Mayo as part of his doctoral research. And it stands for the Vegetation and Sediment Transport model. And as you can see here, it's a 3-module model that links vegetation growth, wind dynamics, and sediment movement. And it is a cellular automaton-based model. So a simple model to look at interactions at the local scale between cells and how they upscale to produce patterns in vegetation, changing sediment movements, and that kind of thing. Now, what Jenny did was to take this model and to add a new module and convert it into what we call the Vista HD model. And you can see there on the screen the paper in ESPL, where the basic outline of the model is explained. But Jenny actually explains it rather better using Lego, and who shouldn't use Lego to explain geomorphological research? I won't run the animation here, but Jenny has a very nice animation to show how you can generate change in sediment dynamics based on these very simple cellular automata structures. But when I say she added a module, what I mean is that she essentially added a vertical module, i.e. the red walls in the Lego setup below, which then the Vista module generates the environmental conditions to influence the wall itself in terms of dune development at the base of the wall, erosion of the wall through sediment being thrown at it, through aeolian processes, and also to consider how rainfall also affects the wall as well. So this is just the structure of the Vista HD model. And the most important thing I want you to note about the model at this stage is that it is used to predict the risk of deterioration, not the actual deterioration. So that's one thing that Jenny's working on now in her postdoctoral research, is to transfer this from risk to absolute quantification of the different types of deterioration. But the great advance that she made during her DPhil, her doctorate, was to add this module and get it working effectively. And she was able to do that thanks to our colleagues at Dunhuang Academy, who were able to help her and Hong Zhang, our research technician, set up a series of monitoring exercises to collect all the input data required. Because the original Vista model was designed and tested in the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa. And Jenny was very concerned to make sure that she had appropriate input data based on the realities of the situation in northwest China, rather than just using data from the Kalahari. So a lot of work went into collecting the data. But I just want to show you how well the model, when it runs, compares with what we see on an actual wall. So the image at the bottom is a wall at Suyang that we know has been exposed to wind and sheltered from rain. And what you can see on that is there's a lot of aeolian abrasion and polishing and pitting towards the top of the wall. The grayscale output from the model there is a similar profile view of a wall in those similar situations. The darker the pixel, the higher the risk of deterioration. And so the point to observe is that it's the areas to the top and also the edges of the wall which seem to have the most deterioration, mirroring pretty well what we see in reality. And to take another case, this is another orientation of walls which are much more exposed to rain but sheltered from the wind. And you can see what Jenny refers to as slurry. So this kind of candle wax kind of appearance on the wall at the bottom, which is where material is washed down the wall in rainfall events. And Vista HD predicts a similar pattern. You see these splurges of material coming down, the dark areas, the higher parts of deterioration, a fairly good match to reality. So emboldened with those results, Jenny decided to use the model to try and do some predictions for how climate change and different management strategies might affect what was going on. And she used, in this case, one long wall, that's the long black line in the central image, and one short wall. And the wind comes from the left-hand side towards the right-hand side. And this simply shows at initial setup the relief that is calculated by the model. So you see this kind of dune building up at the bottom of the wall. And then Jenny ran this model under different climatic change scenarios and different conservation strategy scenarios for about 400 iterations to see what happens. And I just want to show a couple of sets of results here. So first of all, this is the climate change predictions. The grayscale image at the top shows the risks as predicted from the current conditions. So again, you see that in this case, for the long wall, the biggest area of risk of deterioration is at the top and towards the edges of the wall. The red and blue plots show how these different climatic predicted scenarios influence that risk map. So the red shows where the scenarios make the risk of deterioration more severe. The blue shows where it makes it less severe. And the point that I'd like you to take away from this is that it's the increasing wind velocity which has a very strong impact and increases the severity of the deterioration risk quite notably in comparison with changes to rainfall regime, which don't have such a strong impact. But perhaps more importantly for biogeomorphology is the work that Jenny did on looking at different conservation strategies. Because the reason we were asked to collaborate with our colleagues at Dunhuang Academy is because they were interested in some other work that I'd been doing on British ruins, looking at the possibility of nature-based conservation strategies. So essentially growing plants on or around ruin sites and whether that would help protect them or not. Now, the work I'd done in Britain was on stone ruins and was very field-based. But thanks to the contribution of Richard Bailey and colleagues and the cooperation with Dunhuang, we were able to employ a model-based approach to look at a very different setting. So Jenny tested the role of 3 different types of conservation strategy: wind breaks, either singly or in combination, and then increasing the natural vegetation cover, so an 80% increase in vegetation cover. And the point, again, I think you should notice here is that it's the vegetation cover increase which is the most successful, according to this model prediction, for reducing the risk of deterioration on the walls at Soyang. So what we're now doing in collaboration with colleagues there is to run some lab tests to try and get more detail about this so we can go from risk to actual deterioration. And we're also hoping to do some field trials to see whether what we find in the model is actually replicated in the natural environment. But just before I leave the modelling part of the talk, very recently a paper has come out in Earth Surface Dynamics called Vistagram. Well, sorry, the paper isn't called that, but it's about a new evolution of the Vista model called Vistagram, developed by Philippe Gauvin-Bourdon, James King and Liliana Perez, which again builds on Richard Bailey's Vista model and now adds an agent-based model to simulate grazing and add that to the picture. Now, that has huge capacity then to start linking different types of biogeomorphic interactions and start to build up an ecosystem type picture of what is actually going on in any environment. So I want to move towards finishing now by just giving 2 slides about a current paper I'm writing with my good colleague and friend Martin Coombs on biogeomorphology in the Anthropocene. And how this started was a bit of a throwaway comment during a presentation when I said rather boldly that I felt the Anthropocene was having a huge impact on biogeomorphology, and that perhaps through nature-based solutions to some environmental management problems, biogeomorphology could contribute to managing some of the problems in the Anthropocene. And somebody challenged me on that at the end of the talk, and I realized that I had no more to say about it because I hadn't thought any further. So I went away and did some thinking, and this was the starting point, this simple diagram, showing that climate change affects biogeomorphic systems directly, and there's probably some feedback loops, and that some of the other impacts in the Anthropocene, sediment cycle disruption, biodiversity loss, plastics in the environment, might also affect biogeomorphic systems. Well, thanks to an invitation to speak at the Binghamton Symposium in 2021, it suddenly dawned on me that I was actually going to have to move from this kind of vague diagram to something a bit more coherent. And that's where Martin Coombs has really rescued me as I floundered around. So Martin comes a little bit more from an ecological perspective and had been, I guess I could put it like this, banging on about the importance of ecological functional traits for biogeomorphology for some time. And I hadn't really understood what he meant by that. But when I was asked to write this paper, which will be, I hope, published in Geomorphology at some stage this year, I thought, well, let's get together and see if we can put his ideas together with my slight arm waving ideas. So this is the broad structure of the paper, and we're looking at 2 themes: how biogeomorphology is affected by the Anthropocene, in particular, how climate change in the Anthropocene is affecting ecological communities in terms of composition, abundance, and specifically these functional traits. And then the second theme of the paper that we're exploring is how can biogeomorphology contribute to mitigating and adapting to the Anthropocene by managing biogeomorphic functions to enhance the resilience of systems. Perhaps a little bit along the lines of what Jenny Richards has been looking at the Soyang site. So I can't really say much more about that at the moment because that's where we are with that paper. But we're working at the moment now to put our ideas together, to add some examples to it. But the take-home message of that paper is that we hope that by focusing on functions, which comes from a consideration of functional traits through to biogeomorphic functions, that this will help biogeomorphology detect and predict human impacts on biogeomorphic systems and give a better understanding of how biogeomorphology can contribute to tackling environmental changes in the Anthropocene. So please watch this space, open Geomorphology Journal over the next few issues, and hopefully eventually you'll see a paper in there. So I just want to finish by thanking you all for coming along and listening to this talk. I feel a bit odd sitting on my settee talking to myself. And I really want very sincerely to thank the people and landscapes that have inspired me and continue to enrich my research and thinking. And the view that I'm showing you in the image is the view that I have every lunchtime when I go for my therapeutic walk out of my conditions of lockdown, which we're all under still at the moment in the United Kingdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Heather, for this really great talk. Our chat is now open for questions. And feel free to ask. If anybody is embarrassed for some reason to ask a question out loud, feel free to send it either to me or to one of the other conveners here. But we already have some questions, so I will start. The first is from Mary Bork. Great presentation, Heather. Regarding the ants, to what extent are the calculations for heavy agricultural locations that through practice destroy morphology going to influence global sediment calculations?
Wow, Mary, that's a brilliant and rather large question. I think pretty hugely. For example, when we look at ants, agriculture and land use change is one of the major factors that influence ant communities and ant activity. So I think getting more of a handle on how that plays out is going to be really important. But a lot of the work from the Amazon area, where there's huge ant activity, shows that it's concentrated. The biggest mounds, the deepest ant nests are concentrated in areas that are relatively recently disturbed. So where forest has been removed and replaced by forms of agriculture, which then perhaps have also become disturbed. So I can't answer your question as you might have expected, but it's a really good one. So thank you for raising it.
All right, so we have another question. This one is from Abby Stone. Thanks, Heather. Will the Anthropocene, minus the H, be a future term?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. I like that. And in fact, in the ant geomorphology paper, we spent an awful long time trying to get words beginning with ant in it. But it's actually a good question because there are many areas where invasions and introductions of ants, for example, fire ants, which have been introduced to many parts of the USA, are now having quite considerable impacts. So yes, trying to look forward to the Anthropocene, very amusing, is a good idea. But I'd also urge people to look back as well in the geological record and think, are the periods when ants might have been more or less active for whatever reason? Not something I've thought about at all, but something that would be worth considering.
Great. Maybe I'll handle the next one in the chat, which is from Missy Epps, who's asking two questions about the walls in your study. First is, what role do thermal stresses play in this mud wall degradation? And the second, which is related, is that it seems like the tops of the walls will always be most degraded because of the lack of overall confining stresses as you near the top of the wall. How might you remedy that particular avenue of degradation?
Yes, that's a brilliant question, Missy. And so to take the first question, thermal stresses are undoubtedly important. And in fact, to slightly answer your question, Jenny has now moved to looking at the impacts of freeze-thaw cycles on the deterioration of the walls here. So in order to defend a doctorate and limit things down to something that was tractable, we focused almost entirely on the impacts of wind and rain. But it's very obvious that thermal cycling and probably freeze thaw, although the amount of water in the walls is very low, they are undoubtedly important. And excitingly, Jenny has shown me some photos from her experiment to show that we have blistering of some of our rammed earth samples after only a few freeze-thaw cycles. So something is happening. Your second question about stress fields at the top of the walls is a really interesting one. And we haven't looked at that at all, but you are entirely right. That is an inevitable consequence. It would be very exciting to work with people like you, Missy, who know more about that than I do, but also Jiri Brutans from Prague, who's done quite a lot of work on stress fields and weathering of sandstones. I think there's some nice links there between different specialisms. So when we've all got a free moment, maybe we can talk about it.
I can take the next question by Aaron Buffy. It's still about ants. Do you have a sense for how dynamic ant population and their mounds are at a given place through time? Do nest depths, mound diameter, sediment moved, etc. change through time, and on what time scale?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. We know less about the dynamics over time. There have been some very good studies. There's a relatively recent one. I'm afraid I've completely forgotten the authors and the location, where they did study ant colonies over, I think, a decade, and found that there was quite rapid growth in nest sizes over the first few years, and then they stabilized. Anecdotal evidence that we have from one of our walks near Oxford in Wootton shows that areas that are fenced off from grazing and agriculture, ants mounds establish very quickly. They last for a decade or so, and then they seem to die out. But there's a lot more work that needs to be done on those areas. Perhaps there just aren't enough people who like looking at ants yet.
And the last part of the question by Aaron was how much of this sediment that is moved by ants is actually transported away? What is the proportion?
That's a fantastic question. And of course, we don't know that. How much of it then is stored by other geomorphological processes? How much is moved by other animals? So just to slightly answer your question, the ant mounds of Portland by Lasius flavus store sediment in a kind of a temporary mound, which is then covered by richer grass cover than the surrounding grassland, so it's relatively stabilized. But then inevitably bunnies, and I'm sorry but I can't give them their correct title, which is RABBITS, because there is an old tradition in Portland that you mustn't say that word. Won't go into that. But anyway, RABBITS then come and dig into the mound, and the sediment is released, and then it's moved by other slope wash and other processes. So nobody yet, to my knowledge, has looked at these interactions. There may be some work in Australia. David Eldridge, for example, does some very interesting work looking at combinations of biogeomorphic sediment movement.
So I will take the next question, and it is, are the slides available to download? And you can answer it also, but I would like to mention that we are recording, or we have recorded this talk, and it will be uploaded to our website soon.
Yep, so we hope that you'll be able to watch me and do what my students do, which is play me at very fast speed so that they can get on with the lecture and get on with something more interesting. But certainly if anybody wants to have the slides in particular, then just ping me an email or tweet and I'll get back to you.
Great. So we'll just keep going here. Questions are pouring in, so we'll see if we can get to all of them. We've got a question here from Piotr Migon, who's asking, what can you say about lifetimes of ant mounds, especially in comparison with termite mounds? Do they have any lasting effect, and do they leave an imprint ultimately in a paleosol?
Oh, Piotr, that's a really good question. I think that's a largely unknown question. Generally speaking, people say that ant mounds are shorter lived than termite mounds. I'm not sure that's based on a lot of quantitative data. It's probably just looking at the size of them. I don't think we know a lot about that. There are some very interesting hypotheses that link eroded ant mounds to fairy circles and other types of patterned ground. So it may well be that there are longer term impacts. So one of the theories for the fairy circles in northern Namibia in the Kunene area is that they were former ant mounds. So lots of things to test.
We have another question by, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, Dapski Masiec. Ant mounds are composed of mineral material and of organic matter. What are the usual proportion of the two constituents?
Lovely question, lovely question. It depends on the species. So there are different types of mounds. Some species, they're largely organic, with only a little bit of mineral material. Sometimes they have a kind of a stone carapace. Others, like Laceus flavus, the ones from Portland, are nearly all mineral soil material. So you can't generalize about that, but if you know the species that's present, you should be able to estimate that.
Okay, so our next question is from Chris Thomas, and it is, are there any microbiological agents active on the walls themselves? And which further, how will they destabilize the walls?
Yeah, sorry, I'm so excited to answer some of these questions. That's another really good question. We have been doing some work on the microbiology of the walls, thanks to Wu Fasa, one of my colleagues from Dunhuang Academy, who runs their microbiology lab. And he has taken some samples and done some analyses, DNA-based analyses. So we have a pretty good idea now of the kind of species that or taxonomic forming units that are found on the walls. What we don't know is what they're doing. So you asked about deterioration. There's also the possibility that they are bioprotective. So in many cases, these biological soil crusts, because that's what they are effectively, on a vertical surface rather than on a flat surface, they're often protective. They at least protect the walls from aeolian sand transport by providing a kind of a mucal and cellular covering. We don't know much about that yet. That's something, again, that we're interested to do further research on.
Great. Just rolling on here. I'll keep going as long as people are sticking around, because the questions just keep coming in. The next question is from Ankit Verma, who's asking or saying, thanks for a great presentation. From seeing ant mounds myself in Hyderabad, India, and watching Marvel movies, okay, this is a comment. I'm sorry, I didn't scan that enough in advance. Anyway, a very appreciative comment. Next question by Jill Silver. Thanks for your talk. On the Northwest coast in temperate rainforests, ants are a vector of non-native seeds, and that non-native vegetation then alters the growth of early successional native plants in migrating channels. Yeah, and so forth. I hope you have this pulled up. It's quite long. Are there any suggestions? Oh, I'm really sorry. Again, probably someone who just wants to get in touch. I'm going to read the question fully next time. Okay. Next question from Rick Beer Bahia. You hinted at planetary applications of these techniques at the beginning of the talk. Is there anything in particular that comes to mind for you for planetary applications?
Well, I've been working with Dov Korenblit and colleagues looking at the potential for microbiological signatures of life on Mars and other planets. And we have a paper in astrobiology on that topic. And Dov is currently carrying out some bigger studies, which I've contributed some photos to, just seeing whether we can do anything with machine learning and to recognize biological signatures on rock surfaces. So the idea of this would be, is there anything that's very distinctive in terms of biopitting? So microbes that grow on rock surfaces often edge their way into the surface for protection against extreme radiation, for searching for nutrients and water. And that's called by microbiologists the endolithic habit. They want to grow inside. But as they do that, they essentially etch their own little pit. So what we're trying to see is there something distinctive about those in terms of shape, size range, distribution, densities that we could use to look at micro imaging evidence from the rovers on Mars, for example, to see whether they are diagnostic. So again, watch this space. I'm only about the 95th author on the latest work on that, but it's a really interesting project.
Then we have a question by Rajarshi. So it's a question that is not directly aimed for these two topics that you develop in this talk. It's more about biogeomorphology. So he's saying, Paolo Taroli, in a recent paper speaks about biomes being one of the factors of anthropogenic landform evolution. Could you please shed some light on how biota can affect the evolution of these landforms?
Poof. That's a very difficult question. I'm not sure I can actually, to be honest. I think it's a very interesting area. So essentially, and this actually summarizes some of my evenings at home. So one of my husband's areas of speciality is what he calls anthropogeomorphology, so how humans affect the landscapes. And one of my specialities is biogeomorphology. So we have fascinating conversations over dinner about how these two interrelate. But we haven't had any great insights recently. And I think it's a rich area for exploration. But I just haven't really given it any great thought recently. So maybe I'll suggest to Andrew that we have a conversation later on about it.
So we have 2 more comments, but and no more questions. And I think that should be enough for today. We had a lot of questions, and I'm very happy to see that people were very interested. I certainly was very interested. So again, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the talk, Heather, and thank you for everybody for coming. And we will see you hopefully next week.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me, Michael, and everybody. Bye for now.